Thank you again very much for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Lynn Schollett, for the record. I'm the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. I'm joined today by two colleagues, Nicole Kipphut, who is both a survivor and the former Administrator of Victim Services for the New Hampshire Department of Corrections, and Dr. Scott Hampton, Ending the Violence Project Coordinator for the Stratford County Supervised Visitation Center. So I'm going to give a few opening comments, and then I'll step back since it's a little tight here, and we'll have Dr. Hampton and Nicole come up.
Great, thank you.
Together, we hope to share with you an overview of victim experiences in the parole system. And I'm hopeful that among the three of us, we'll get to all the issues that you're interested in. And if you're open to holding questions to the end, we can all three be available for questions. The Coalition is an umbrella organization for the 12 community-based crisis centers in New Hampshire that provide free and confidential services to victims of domestic and sexual violence, stalking, and human trafficking year-round, every day of the year. And we work with victims not just across the span of their lifetime, but also through the many stages of their victimization. The initial crime that a victim experiences may be the first traumatic experience, but it is almost never the last one. How a victim heals from trauma is deeply impacted by the people and the systems that they connect with after the crime. When victims who, through no fault of their own, are harmed, when they are given a chance to speak, information to help them control their lives, and the autonomy to make decisions, often about their safety, they are much better able to heal than when they are dismissed or not heard or not meaningfully engaged in the aftermath of the crime. As a result, the Coalition routinely collaborates with other professionals to work to ensure that systems are structured in such a way that they will incorporate the voices and experiences of victims. And that's also why Dr. Hampton and Nicole are with us today. So I'd like to share one specific example that could inform the state's work around the parole system. New Hampshire has implemented a program that is designed to ensure that people, whether it's victims, family members, community members, other professionals, have access to information about the location of an individual who is in custody in New Hampshire. This system is called VINE, Victim Information and Notification Every Day. It's an electronic system, and it allows anyone who's interested to sign up to receive notifications whenever an offender in custody in New Hampshire moves to a new location. These notifications can come in a variety of ways. They can be emails, texts, phone calls, TTY, going to an app. This system is available in every county in the state, as well as through the Department of Corrections. In a recent one-year period in New Hampshire, there were over 60,000 searches done in the VINE program for New Hampshire offenders. The result is that when victims have information, they can better safety plan. So the feedback that we receive from victims is that having time-sensitive information about the status of an offender after a crime helps restore their peace of mind and helps their healing process. I think why this is important is that what we've learned is that the experience of victimization extends well beyond the crime itself. So how can we take the lessons we've learned from VINE and apply them to the parole system? When we think about the parole system, although victims have an opportunity to speak to the parole board, they must do so in very close proximity to the abuser who is going to be released someday. The trauma the victim has experienced may make it difficult for them to present information both in a comprehensive way and in a linear way. The goal behind victims participating in the criminal legal system is for them to have notice and a meaningful opportunity to be heard. If the legal process re-traumatizes a victim, the victim is deprived of that opportunity for meaningful input in a case. And in this case, if a victim is too frightened to testify just feet away from the offender, the parole board is not getting all of the information they may need to make a fully informed decision. The vast majority of criminal cases in New Hampshire, about 98% of cases, plead rather than going to trial. In that plea process, most often the offender pleads either to fewer offenses or lower level offenses than they actually committed. And as a result, the parole board may not have information about the more serious offenses or the whole range of offenses that were committed by the offender. For the victim, however, they continue to live every single day with the impact of all of those offenses. So as you consider possible modifications to the parole board, system, I encourage you to take into consideration ways that victims can have meaningful input without being re-traumatized. And today, Nicole and Dr. Hampton are going to expand upon that concept and provide some very specific examples to you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I am Nicole Kipphut. I am here I want to thank you first of all for allowing me to come here today. I'm coming here twofold. One as the professional who had worked for the Department of Corrections for 13 years, and then as well as to bring my personal story of someone who has been a victim of crime and who has gone through the parole board hearing process. I recently, in recent years, came across an acronym, HOPE, and it stands for Hearing Other People's Experiences. And I feel like that is really important in order to create change and to bring lasting healing. So let me first talk about my professional experience. So working for the Department of Corrections, I started when I was 19 as an AmeriCorps. Started right in as a victim advocate at that point. So I served most of my time at the Department of Corrections as an advocate supporting survivors of felony level crime ranging from sexual assault, domestic violence, homicide, burglary, you name it. I was their advocate in that. I also worked as the administrator of that unit for about 7 years before leaving the Department of Corrections in 2022. And now I'm at a local college as a violence prevention educator. So my time there, I've supported, just to give a few examples, during my time there supporting daughters of homicide victims who were 10 years old when their mom was murdered, who are then 45 years old coming back before the parole board. The fear stays, the trauma remains. I've supported young survivors of sexual assault that were assaulted by family members who had challenges of putting together statements and engaging in a very unknown process such as the parole board. Again, the fear stays. I've supported law enforcement families who have been burglarized, who have had home invasions, and are victimized by homicide. The fear stays. Those are just to name a few. But I feel like I can bring a lot of information to you because I have been through and sat through and been a part of hundreds of parole board hearings. Starting back in 2008 all the way to 2022, I've sat with all kinds of different members under all kinds of different leaderships and can bring a lot of those stories, and again, happy to answer questions, but I've supported hundreds and hundreds of victims and families through that process, including my own. So I'm going to dip into a little bit of my personal experience with that. So I'm a survivor of childhood sexual assault. My offender was my father. I went through the investigation process twice. Once when I was 11, again when I was 22 years old. This included a deposition, hearings for sentencing, and my offender was finally given a 10-year term with the New Hampshire Department of Corrections. About 7.5 years into his term, he completed his sex offender treatment and was then up for parole. As an experienced provider at that point for victim services, it was still shocking for me to get that notice in the mail, and still quite the process for me to engage in, even as someone, again, who has been before the parole board, probably knows the Department of Corrections too well at this point, having been there for so long. But I can also say that it was empowering for me as well as a survivor. And I'll get much more into that a little bit more, but just know that it was challenging and emotionally draining for me as well. So what I'm going to invite you to do with me for the next few minutes is to hear my narrative and my personal experience in going through that process, but also the professional experience that I bring, and kind of see it through the lens of a survivor for a few minutes. So I'm going to talk about my parole board experience. So just to give you a little bit of context to that, the first hearing that I took place in was in November of 2020, so it really wasn't even that long ago. Ironically, I was pregnant then. And I went through that parole board hearing. My offender lacked accountability for his crimes. He was actually denied parole. I'm going to talk a little bit more about accountability and the importance of that to survivors, including myself. He was denied parole. He then had a second parole board hearing in April of 2021. I then returned in front of the parole board still pregnant at that point, within a month of my labor and delivery due date. At that point, he actually had hired an attorney. And in between the first hearing and the second hearing, his attorney submitted a letter to the parole board, essentially blaming me for his original denial, and requesting that I not be present at his next one. Little does he know, it's part of the victim's bill of rights for me to be present. So I had to fight back a little bit harder than I anticipated. After discussions with Attorney General's office, the Department of Corrections, I still attended that second parole board hearing and still provided some testimony, a victim impact statement alongside my two sisters. So the offender at that point was actually granted parole and was given a no contact order and a travel condition. He ended up living up north, but when I, as the victim, because as a victim, you actually end up doing a ton of work on your own because being a victim is not easy, it takes work. I regularly looked him up on the sex offender registry, which is a public forum, to ensure that he was registered. I had asked that he be kept out of Concord because that was my hometown. At this point, I had my family. I didn't want him in Concord. They had granted that. Well, he had an alternate address of Pennacook, which is a suburb of Concord, which was a stone throw away from my husband's place of employment, and a place that I passed by often. So then I had to go back to the parole board and then fight for him not to be allowed in Pennacook. And I just share that with you again, just to reiterate that, and to talk and echo what Lynn was saying earlier, and the lasting impact that crime has on somebody. As much as I love to believe that there is a lot of closure when it comes to sentencing someone and going to prison, and there is some closure that comes with it, it doesn't end there. It continues, and for years and years, even now, 10 years into my own healing process where I've been in counseling, it still hurts. And there's still times where I am triggered and I still have to navigate all of that. So there's a lifetime impact on victims that I want to address quickly. And I'll kind of dip in and out of the personal and professional experience that I have. So we know that trauma has an impact on us mentally, physically, emotionally, economically. I'm still paying out of pocket for counseling. It's expensive to be a survivor. And again, the closure that people assume that we have doesn't always come. For some, the grief and healing process is very different for some people. Some are able to get to acceptance, others are not. Some people remain angry, and that's okay. Our job is to meet them where they're at and provide them a system that meets them where they're at so they can take further steps in their healing. One way, and I want to talk about the Victim Bill of Rights, because that can take the impact, and it can either provide healing for some. The Victim Bill of Rights is designed to provide healing for victims and to give them a voice and agency in the process, depending on how the criminal justice process uses that and actually plays that out. So as victims, we have multiple statutory rights, one of them being timely notice of all court proceedings. Lynn talked about this a little bit more. We have the right to appear and be heard for any disposition, plea, sentencing, parole board hearing, the right to be notified of any changes of status, the right to address and submit written statements for consideration for parole, and to be notified of that outcome. So let's talk about some of those processes within the criminal justice system and how they can be healing if managed correctly, and with the understanding of survivor justice. So the parole board hearing process first, let's talk about that. Some victims have found the parole board hearing process to be re-traumatizing. Others have found it to be empowering. I kind of fit in that category if it falls under both. I found it both healing. I also found it very re-traumatizing and re-victimizing. And one of that reasons is because as much as we retain information on when that term is up or when that person is up for parole, it comes really quickly. That 7.5 years that passed between sentencing and parole went like this. And it's like all of a sudden I'm being faced with this big idea of my safety now is compromised, because I felt safe when my offender was in prison. He couldn't come out to find me, he couldn't reach out to me, so on and so forth. So then we have this parole board hearing process when someone's up for parole. So as the administrator, as the victim advocate, the parole board hearing process preparation is extensive, and it's extensive for a reason. It's because we're trying to make it the least retraumatizing process as possible on our end as victim advocates. The rest is up to the parole board. So we provided notices of hearings about 30 to 60 days in advance. The victim would receive that notice, and then we immediately start the prep phase. The prep phase is, do you attend? Do you not attend? How do you attend safely? Can we figure out a way for you to attend safely? We then start working on a parole board hearing statement. Keeping in mind, we're informing them parole board hearings at the times were about 10 minutes apiece. So from 9 till 2 or 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, parole board members are hearing offender after offender after offender given 10 minutes. And so within that 10-minute time frame, they have to address the offender, what they've done while incarcerated, plans of release, and then also address the victim in that space. So we are trying to plan with victims on talking about the relationship of the case, the impact of crime, requests for no contact order, so on and so forth. And we're being asked to squish it into this really nice packet of 3 minutes or so, so that we don't feel like we're going over time and such, which is such a disservice and silences victims. And then we talk about the setup of the room. We tour the room. We talk about what kind of information is going to be addressed with the offender, because the offender, as Lynn had mentioned, is within 10 feet of the victim. They walk in, they're in handcuffs, they're in their uniform, they can make eye contact with a survivor, and they can address them at some points, and I've seen that happen. But we did as much work as we could to ensure that didn't happen. But preparing survivors for that and what that looks like. At the end of the 10-minute hearing, they're either approved, denied, or continued. Most of the time, they're approved for parole by their minimum. So we're preparing victims for that reality. You're gonna go into this, you're gonna prepare really hard for this, you're gonna sit through a 10-minute hearing, you're gonna give it all you've got, and you're gonna come out and likely be disappointed because the offender is likely gonna gain the privilege of parole, which for a victim can, again, compromise that level of safety that they have set up for themselves over all these years. So that's where our job as advocates too, we had a lot of expectation management that we had to do. We had to talk and talk and talk about all the work that they're putting into it, their risk-benefit analysis of them even attending to provide that, because it is a lot of build-up, there's a lot of anxiety that comes with that to, again, go before a board that you know nobody, and then to sit next to your offender essentially, and then alongside an advocate who you've been working with for a little bit but don't really know. They've worked within a system where trust has been broken, and now they're supposed to trust me, they're supposed to trust the parole board with all this information, and to keep them at the forefront of their minds. So we do a lot of expectation management, and the reality is that this is much more complex than what meets the eye, but we do our best. So victim input. I already mentioned there's not enough time for survivors to give input. It's really uncomfortable for a survivor. When I first started in 2008, actually, survivors were given the opportunity to address the parole board confidentially, which was huge. There were so many survivors who, in my years of working with them, would be much more willing to provide a authentic, real, powerful victim impact statement if they knew the offender wasn't going to be present. And so for a time period, we were allowed that, and it was remarkable to see how someone could come to that, present, and leave feeling empowered because they didn't have to see the offender, and they were able to share as much information as possible. That was taken away from them somewhere along the lines. I can't remember the date, but when I went back to work for Victim Services in 2015, after taking a little break and doing other things, it was back to victims had to be presenting in front of the offender, in front of the parole board, no confidentiality because of the offender's right to know. So that was removed. I feel strongly that the parole board would gain a lot more important information if they were given that confidentiality possibility. Inside the parole board hearing too, accountability needs to be addressed. I hit on accountability earlier, and I want to talk about that because we know this process can be harmful or helpful for survivors. And survivors are the primary stakeholders here. However, they were never asked to be here. The crime happened to them, and they had responsibility then to try to provide information and do the best that they could to make it through investigations and hearings and whatnot. But they never asked to be here. But they should be our primary stakeholders here. And our goal should be healing for them, but also healing for the offender. We want healing for the offender because we want them to get out and be productive and do well. So I had read a book recently called Truth and Repair, How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice by Judith Herman. And I just want to read a quick quote from her about accountability. She notes, public acknowledgement of the truth as the necessary beginning of justice. And then she goes on to say, every survivor I interviewed for this book, and I dare say every survivor with whom I have ever worked, has wished above all for acknowledgement and vindication. Survivors want the truth to be recognized and the crime to be denounced by those in their communities who matter to them. But this means that survivors must actually matter to their wider communities. It also means that their credibility must be judged without prejudice. I would say that our wider community involves the parole board. The way that the parole board and Department of Corrections is structured is not healing for all survivors at this point. Survivors are cut short and told that their voices don't matter. Instead, victims often witness victim blaming and lack of accountability in these parole board hearings. And accountability takes work. It takes work on the offender's part, and they should be held to that higher standard. Because if they are held to that standard and make that standard, then we have a belief that maybe they'll meet the standards when they're released. And it must be addressed in parole board hearings. I want to talk about my personal experience with the accountability piece at my hearing. And it makes me laugh because the lack of accountability was almost laughable. For a lot of hearings I've sat through outside of mine, the accountability is minimized. It's reduced to minimizations, deflections, and wrapped up in subpar, phony, rehearsed responses. Often victim blaming, and I'll share them with you at my hearing. When my dad was asked why he was in prison, he responded, I had a sex charge brought against me. No, myself and my two sisters were all his victims. He was sent to 10 years. He was not sentenced for one violation. He then further noted he wanted to teach me about sex, but he went too far. This is the best one. He noted, they touched me inappropriately. Keep in mind, I was 11. He blamed me as his victim and made me the offender in this case. He then said there was a little bit of fondling on my part, but it wasn't pre-planned and it just happened. Keep in mind, the abuse was for years and years and years. It was pre-planned and it didn't just happen. I say that because it was really important for me to know at that point that A, I was not safe. This offender who had been in prison for 7.5 years, who had been through intensive sex offender treatment, who had years to think about his offenses, was truly not rehabilitated. If he was, those answers would have been very different. And then I told you he went on to hire an attorney who then blamed me for it all. This naturally put up my level of fear and my ability to trust the system and to do what they're supposed to do to rehabilitate offenders. And this makes me question whether he's going to be good on parole or not. And I told you, as soon as he was out, he was already pushing the envelope. He was already trying to get as close back to Concord, actually in Concord, because Pennacook is a suburb. Again, a little bit of a lack of ability to trust the system here. But I want to talk about how that plays into violations of probation and parole as well. So what we do know is the vast majority of incarcerated individuals on parole have multiple violations before they're actually violated. It's not a one and done deal. Usually when they're coming back before the parole board for revocation, they have multiple rule violations. Many of them are noted as nonviolent. But nonviolent to some may actually be very concerning to another. These nonviolence of smoking a joint, debunk the truth about nonviolent violations, or just being mistakes. These are red flags that survivors are looking at to gauge their level of safety. And these violations can be dangerous: not showing up for parole meetings with their parole officer, breaking curfew, drinking alcohol, or using substances. Again, these may seem non-violent to you, but to me that would show, this person can't abide by the rules. What's that next thing that they're gonna do? What's that next step? Is my dad moving back to, or living in Pennacook? What's my odds of running into him and being absolutely re-traumatized? Or what's the odds that he's gonna drive past my house that I was still living at, that I grew up in, and that he was abusing me in? So those are all those questions, and it's important to keep victims involved in that process so that they know what their level of safety is. It's important that they remain notified of those parole revocation hearings and given the opportunity to speak. It was in 2020 when I worked with the parole board chairwoman to remove the condition that victims were not allowed to attend those parole revocation hearings, and she allowed them to start coming again. And that was a really great option for survivors to be able to come, because they were being silenced once again, saying that their point of view, their concerns are not important. So I'm thankful for that. So best practice, and I'm gonna wrap up because I'm probably too long-winded here and I apologize. There's so much importance in best practice and remaining victim-centered, rigorously victim-centered, whether it's in the parole board hearing process, providing victim notification for our safety, and it's really, again, part of our healing process and regaining some of that power that we've lost at so many points along the way. So what we know about restorative practices: so crime is a violation of people and relationships. Crime creates harms, needs, and obligations. And individuals most impacted, most affected, should be meaningfully included and empowered. That would be the survivor. So we need to offer more restorative practices that open pathways to address harm within the parole board hearing process and beyond. We need to continue with programs such as the Accountability Letter Bank, Victim Offender Dialogue, a victim information and notification system that provides those notifications, and education on restorative practices that focus on addressing harm and the offender's obligation in addressing that harm. We need to have more trauma-informed training during the post-conviction process. I will say that when I was the administrator, I did go before the parole board in some of their meetings to try to give them that education on what it meant to be trauma-informed, and I felt like that was somewhat helpful, but there could have been so much more education provided to those members. We don't want victims and survivors walking away feeling like their voice was not heard, that it was just a checklist of getting the offender out the door and then feeling further silenced. We need referral service, we need interagency collaboration, and we need to, again, ensure meaningful participation for victims in the post-conviction process. And that's where I end. I'm sorry, Son, I took up so much time, but I'll hand it over.
Keep going.
I can't, I'm running out of a voice. I'm happy to answer any questions. I do have to leave here by 12:15-ish, but any questions that you do have for me that I can't answer if I'm not here can be provided to the coalition. I'm happy to get back to you with a response. But yeah, I'll let Scott take over and then we'll go from there.
I just wanted to say thank you for coming today. Your perspective is so important. We value it. Thank you for sharing, your story. Not easy, and we appreciate it.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
And if you wouldn't mind actually emailing if you had anything in writing, if you emailed it to the committee, maybe the coalition can help that. We'd really appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah. I'm happy to give you as much as you'd like.
Thank you.
I'm very passionate about it.
What she said. Any questions? My name is Dr. Scott Hampton. 2004. At this point, I had been working with offenders. I run an agency called Ending the Violence in Dover, been doing that since 2000. Before that, I was working at a community mental health center running their family violence program, working with perpetrators of domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, and a little bit of substance abuse on the side when I got bored. And so I've been doing it for about 15 years. When 2004 came along, and to date I probably worked with maybe 5,000 offenders or so, and had a lot of contact with victims along the way. So we have something in our program called partner contacts, where it's sort of an open door policy. For any offender in our program, their current partner, ex-partner, current victim, ex-victim, I'm going to be an ex-victim, could call us and just ask us about, what's your program like? What can I expect? Is it my fault? Should we go to couples counseling? A lot of questions. And so what I really liked about Nicole's part is you had this unique opportunity to hear someone who's on both sides, got the professional and the personal, and that is rare. So what I want to do is just to try and supplement that a little bit with I do a workshop called Pulling Back the Curtain. We sort of pull back the curtain and see what's going on inside of the minds of the people we work with. And some of the quotations that Nicole gave in terms of what her father said after treatment is pretty alarming. But we'll address that in a little bit. So 2004, one of the things I had noticed after about 15 years of work was we had a number of people who were sort of signing up for our frequent flyer program. They were coming back to the program a second time or a third time, getting rearrested. And I was curious about that. I was like, well, is there anything that's sort of a commonality between these people? What is it that gets you to cycle through the system over and over? So I talked to some of our community collaborators and specifically to the county attorney's office and said, have you guys noticed anything that seems to be a common theme? And they didn't have an answer right away. I got a call back about 3 months later. And the county attorney said, well, I do have an answer for you. I'm a little discouraged, a little bit puzzled, but it's an answer. I said, well, what's that? She said, well, it appears that the highest risk time for reoffense is when they walk out of jail. Hey, there's a rehabilitative model for you, right? So I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense, but it turns out it actually made a lot of sense. And this was getting rearrested within 7 to 10 days after getting released. It's like, wow, I'm going the wrong direction here. So, but we did sort of deep dive in this to take a look at what some of the factors might be, and then it started to make a lot of sense. So first of all, imagine that you're an offender who has this sense of entitlement and privilege and says, my spouse ought to be doing what, I tell that person to do, and this person defies you to the point where they're calling the authorities, and as they put it, she got me arrested. Not I did something that led to, no, she got me arrested. Or like when they say she slapped me upside the head with a restraining order. It's always an interesting phrasing. And so if he thinks that, and this can go both ways. I mean, it's not that all perpetrators are men and all victims are women, that whole thing. But the majority of the harm definitely goes that direction. So if he thinks that she caused this problem and he gets sent away, he's going to sit there and stew. And it's like pulling back a rubber band. The longer he's there, when you finally let it go, they're looking for revenge, retaliation. So that part makes sense. Second factor is if you want to send someone into an environment that challenges the oppressive, abusive attitudes, misogyny, sexism, homophobia, racism, and so on, is prison and jail the best place to send them? Is this really the atmosphere? When I walk through, I do work in the county jail, I've been doing for a number of years, and the conversations I overhear, this is anything other than healthy relationship stuff that's coming out. Third factor, we didn't have any programming at the time in our county jail to offset some of this, to challenge some of these individual beliefs as well as the cultural beliefs that were supporting abusive and coercive actions towards a family member. But here's the fourth factor. The fourth one was we had some people who actually took the issue seriously. Some of the offenders, they get arrested, they go to jail, and they actually do want to change. They do want to develop a healthy lifestyle in which they're getting their needs met in ways that are not causing problems for themselves or for other people. But here's what happens. One guy is in jail. He gets a letter from his attorney saying, all your bail conditions have been removed, including that no contact order. Okay, fine. He then gets released, and he goes, okay, I want to make things right. I want to go talk to my partner, tell her that I'm going to be a better husband, boyfriend, father, whatever. So he goes over to the house, best of intentions. He's there for 10 minutes. All of a sudden, I'm sorry, I do the way they treat it in the police academy, right? And there is a cadence to it. And Officer Bob comes in, and says, would you mind placing your hands behind your back? I'm arresting you for violating a protective order. And the guy goes, oh, well, you don't understand, my bail condition's actually been lifted. What he didn't understand, what the arrestee did not understand, was that while there was a bail condition in place, there was also a civil protective order issued by the same judge in the same courthouse on the same day for the same reason with the same restrictions. But just because one gets lifted doesn't mean the other one gets lifted. So what was happening, we had some people who were getting arrested due to lack of education, lack of information. There are good reasons to arrest people, this ain't one of them. So what we did back in 2004 was we started, we contacted the Office on Violence Against Women through which we had a prosecution grant in Stratford County, but we had some additional funding that we could use discretionary. And we said, can we run a pilot program where we do services for offenders in the jail? And eventually they said yes. We don't normally fund batterers programs, but we'll give it a shot because it loads to victim safety. And it had some very good benefits. One of the things it did is it got around all the excuses that I used to hear for guys not coming to my group. Well, I couldn't get transportation. Yeah, you can't walk down the hall. I couldn't get time off from work. Yeah, they'll give you time off in jail. I couldn't afford it. Well, you're not having to pay for it. Department of Corrections is paying for it. The other thing it did was it demystified the process. So instead of thinking, oh, there's this batterers group I have to go to, and they think they're going to be slammed up against the wall and shamed and bare bulb, confess all your sins kind of thing, and feeling awful about themselves. It's really a healing kind of program, holding people accountable, but in a way that's going to benefit everybody. So they had a chance to taste that program, so when they got onto the community, they were more likely to sign up for the program. The other advantage is judges are more likely to sentence someone for a short period of time in the county jail if they knew they were going to do something productive. If it wasn't just warehousing them, just, if the judge thinks, well, I don't want to put you in jail for a minor thing if you're going to lose your job. That doesn't seem to be helping anything. Well, now they're going to do something productive. So that's where my interest we started the program back in 2007. My interest in programming behind the walls started to develop. But the important thing to keep in mind when I want to spend some time on is that we need to be really mindful about what those services are and how we think about it. What's our goal, what's the problem, and what's an effective way of addressing them. So one of the questions that comes out, which is probably one of the most important questions we hear, is what's the chance, parole boards are thinking about this, what's the chance that this person will be a recidivism statistic, this person? Well, we have to take a close look at that. We think about what recidivism means. Recidivism means, did you get rearrested? Does that mean you're not being abusive? Not necessarily, right? So we have some people who are a recidivism success. They don't get arrested because they are now a healthy, responsible, respectful partner. Great, glad to see it. Does happen. We have other people who decide they don't want to get arrested again, and they find more effective ways of intimidating the partner so she wouldn't dare call the police. They show up as a success. Abject failure, right? So we have to be really careful about how we think about the work, how we measure the work. Someone asked me how successful is my program, and I say, 100%. Really? That's impressive. Why? Well, no one has ever assaulted someone while sitting in my group. Well, who cares, right? They're not there to learn how to sit with a group of men and not hit someone. It's like you send them to prison and say, well, he hasn't assaulted a woman in 5 years. He hasn't seen a woman in 5 years. So that doesn't necessarily reduce his inclination to abuse, and only reduces his opportunity to abuse. So we need to think about how reliable our information is when someone's behind the wall if we're relying on, well, you haven't done X in a period of time. So what I want to talk about just for a moment is the different kinds of services that could be offered and that are typically offered. Probably the most common one is to send someone to an anger management program. And we think, well, this guy, obviously, when he gets mad, he hits his wife, therefore, he's got an anger management problem. Well, I've had guys in my group that will correct that misconception. One guy in particular, and I've heard many versions of this, he said, I don't have an anger management problem. I have an anger management solution. What do you mean? He said, well, when I get angry, my wife gets scared. When my wife gets scared, she does what I want her to. Solution. Right? So we said, well, but can you manage your anger? And the misconception there is that you don't need to manage a feeling, right? Feelings are like weather forecasts. You know, you look at the weather forecast, no one says, well, I have to manage the weather forecast better. No, you don't. You pay attention to the weather forecast, you notice that it says it's gonna rain, you bring an umbrella. So you make decisions based on what that information tells you. So a guy gets angry, anger doesn't lead to violence. Anger is information. I'm unhappy, I think it's your fault. Now I have choices. I can take a swing at you, I can go get drunk, I can go have sex with someone, I can go for a run, I can pet my dog, I can consult with someone else, I can take a nap. We have lots of options, but for so long we've been teaching people that anger leads to violence or anger causes violence, that people act as though it's true. It's not. And we need to confront those messages when we do this. In a program, we will confront that belief system. So as you think anger causes you to be violent, so last time you were in court and the judge told you something, to do something you didn't want to do, how did you feel? I was angry. Did you punch the judge? Oh, you didn't. Why not? I thought you could manage your anger. Well, the thing is, they can control their anger anytime they want to, and they definitely want to in the court, because as one guy said, I can't take a swing at the judge, my you-know-what would be you-know-where in 2 seconds. But then they go home, walk through the front door, go through this anger management rinse, and all of a sudden they don't have those skills anymore. Fact is, they always have those skills. It's like when we talk about sex offenders. You have some guy who is, Uncle Fred has convinced the parents that he'd make a great babysitter through the grooming process they typically involved in. And so he's going to babysit the kids, and the 2 parents go off to watch a movie, and he's about ready to descend upon little Timmy, and the parents come back in the house because they forgot the tickets for the movie theater. Does he say, I'm sorry, I have deviant arousal patterns, I can't control myself, I'll be with you after I molest your child? No, of course not. He stops on a dime, right?
Sir, I don't mean to interrupt you. What I'm hoping that you can share with us is, you know, our task is that we're looking at the adult parole system and
Yes.
its impact, and with the distinct goal of making recommendation. And so
Yes.
we would absolutely be interested in, you know, of course, I think you're identifying, or what I'm hearing is the lack of appropriate services
Yes.
for offenders. So I'm wondering if you wanted to, you know, be more specific about what we have, what we don't have, things like that. I think that would be really helpful for the committee.
Sure. So where we currently are is we have these programs in place that are not addressing the core issue. So we have ones that are treating the anger management, we have ones that are treating substance abuse issues, because we believe that somehow, like one guy said, I originally told you I only hit my wife because I was drunk, now I realize I drank so I could hit her. And so what we need to do is we have programming in place that makes it look like we're solving a problem, and we are solving some problems. We're solving other issues, but these issues are not related to the cause of the abuse. We had a couple of people who were in state prison a number of years ago, and at the time they were put up for an early release. This was under the Sentence Review Modification Board, and 2 people were Eric Grant and Steve Oakman. They were put up for early release. Both guys had killed their spouses in really horrific kind of ways, and they were put up for early release. At the time, what could happen is the warden could put up names of people who performed really well in jail or prisons, with model inmates. They put these 2 guys up because they had accomplished so much. So they had gotten a college education, they became master woodworkers, they ran prayer groups, they did all these wonderful things. And so they were put up so they could get released even earlier than the original early release date. But the problem was that neither of them, because they brought their case forward and the Attorney General's office challenged this, neither of them had addressed anything about recidivism. It didn't address anything with regards to what's your inclination to continue to be abusive once you are released. So they had this, they were successful in terms of improving their own lives, but they had done nothing to reduce their risk of harming people, especially the women, once they got released. So the thing that we want to be taking a look at is what are the appropriate services. There's a handout that you guys will get that has a list of some programs that are done nationally. There's a program in this organization called the Batterers Intervention Service Coalition in Detroit, or outside of Detroit, Michigan. And so there are two programs, one for male inmates, one for female inmates, that talk about that re-entry process. So you'll see some pieces for that. So we do have programming that's available so that they're doing the work that they need to do. One of the things that we would want to change once someone comes up in front of the parole board, and Nicole already alluded to this, was this whole accountability process. One of the things that we'll do in our program is we have them provide what we call accountability statements. And so we want them to take full ownership in terms of what they've done. Someone comes up and says, yeah, I feel really sorry for what I did, or won't do it again. Meaningless. So we want them to be able to address, what did you do, with whom did you do it, how many times did you do it, what was the impact of what you did, how remorseful are you for it, if you were presented with a similar situation in the future, how would you be reacting differently? And the most difficult thing for offenders to acknowledge is what we call intention. So what they'll typically say is, when I hurt someone, that was the worst mistake I ever made. Worst mistake I ever made in the relationship. No. What he did was not a mistake. A mistake is, I tell you that 11 times 11 is 144. Now that's 12 times 12. I try to give you the right answer, but I end up with the wrong answer. Or I try to hit one person, but I hit the person next to them. A mistake is when you don't do what you set out to do. These guys did exactly what they set out to do. Nicole's story. Dad did exactly what he set out to do. This wasn't a mistake. The girls didn't cause it. None of that is true. And for us to assess the risk of them continuing to be abusive, they have to take ownership for what they've done. So we go through there's a thing called a clarification process we use with batterers, we use with sex offenders. And they have to write out this really long presentation that says, I'm going to tell you what I was thinking, feeling, and believing and doing before, during, and after, and own the entire thing. So this is my understanding of what's going on, and to be able to present that and be able to say, here's, and open themselves up for questioning. Ask me any question about that, and I'll give you the answers to it. There are a number of the other thing I would say is we have a number of risk assessment tools available that we use in a lot of different settings. We use them in hospitals, we use them when police officers show up to a domestic violence call, we use them, victim advocates use them when they're interviewing victims. And what we want people to do is to go through that checklist. And in my program, whether I'm working with batterers or sex offenders, I go through every single risk factor and I ask them to tell me the extent to which they've done each one of these things. So just to give you a couple of examples of of the importance of some of them. You have a man who's abused his partner. If he's also forced her to have sex against as well, she's 7.6 times more likely to die. Right? If he strangled her, she's 7 times more likely to die than if she had been strangled. So we have these risk factors. We have, and we'll provide you with all this stuff. Right? All these sort of screening tools to say these are the things that are going to tell you the risk that someone's going to seriously hurt or even kill someone when they get out. All of these things need to be addressed in a program when they're behind the walls. The advantage we have is we got a captive audience, right? We got an opportunity. If they can earn a college degree, they certainly have time to deal with restructuring their lives, their belief system. What's particularly difficult or challenging is that their belief system, this isn't an individual pathology thing, this is a socio-cultural problem. And so sometimes I'll say, I get a guy for an hour and a half a week in my group, and then he returns to the locker room for the other 166 and a half hours of the week. The advantage when we have someone behind the walls is we have an opportunity to do some pretty intensive work. I think I'll stop at that point, just so you have a chance to ask questions of any of us.
My only question, like you kind of alluded to, they can do really well in their program while they're, behind bars, but is there anything in place currently that helps them keep putting those, what they learned in practice when they're released?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things, and I was going to mention this, is we do have a sense of how we can be most successful with people who have crossed the line. And this works when someone's just first arrested, as well as what we need to do afterwards. There's a researcher, Ed Gondoff, from Indiana University of Pennsylvania, who's like an international guru on offender work. And what he discovered in his research is that the speed with which we respond and the consistency with which we respond are really key. So he said, you get someone arrested for a DV crime, the faster you can get them through the system and into the program, there's a sort of window of opportunity where they have this subjective discomfort, like, oh my God, this is terrible, I got arrested. We have an opportunity to go in right then. So the quicker we respond, getting them into services, and this is where the probation or parole system is really important. The quicker we respond to their violating any of the rules. Nicole talked about, oh, it's only smoking pot, no, any violation whatsoever. Because what they do is they look for cracks in the system. Remember, there's a sociocultural support for what they do, so they don't believe that what they're doing is wrong necessarily. And they get plenty of stuff out there that says what they're doing is okay. So we need to respond immediately, and we need to be consistently, bless you,
Thank you.
so that they realize we're all singing the same tune. Only takes one person in the choir to sing off tune, and it ruins the whole thing. These guys are looking for those exceptions. The other thing I would say is in our research on lethality, taking things to the extreme, there are a number of risk factors. I mentioned a couple of them that says this person's more likely to be seriously killed or die. There are also what we call protective factors, things that suggest you're less likely to be seriously hurt. And one of those is that the two people never lived together. I'm not going to spend time on that. The other one is whether or not the person got arrested, or did the person get noticed. So just the fact that someone gets arrested or gets identified by the PO that you're not following the rules, just the fact that they get hooked up initially tends to reduce the risk to victims. So this is why it's so important we tighten up the system and have a very quick response after they've done the work they need to do in the prison. So I would suggest the work that Nicole's dad did in the prison was probably, it was either did a terrible job in the program, or the program didn't cover the stuff they needed to, because it totally missed the point.
And I'm curious about your comments about the risk assessment tool. Is it your testimony that the risk assessment tools that the state are currently using are not rigorous enough, and that there are other evidence-based risk assessment tools that we could be using?
I think we need to review those and make sure that the risk factors that we're looking at are relevant to because what we have now is more of a general kind of risk rather than one specific, more specifically targeting the issues that we've been talking about today. And so you have some general risk ones, that's fine, but we need to look at the more targeted ones as well. Yeah, we need to review those.
Thank you. Any other questions? Welcome to Representative Wheeler. I'm grateful for everyone's testimony today. I didn't know, Lynn, if you had further comments you wanted to provide.
I think we're all set. Thank you very much.
Okay, we really appreciate you coming and giving very in-depth testimony. I found it very helpful. I was writing ferociously for recommendations. I mean, again, I want this committee to be very solutions oriented, and you provided some of that concrete recommendations, so I appreciate that very much.
And I think I'm speaking for all, feel free to contact any of us with follow-up questions or other concerns.
And if you could provide in writing what you had, and again, we are looking for concrete recommendations, so to the extent the coalition wants to provide them to us, we welcome those. Thank you. At this point, I want to